In June 1776, the Continental Congress selected a committee from among them to craft a document which would illustrate the reasons that the 13 British colonies were to secede from the mother country, England. From that committee, a young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson was selected to wordcraft the document. Beginning on June 11th and for 15 days, Thomas Jefferson wordcrafted the document. After that, he submitted the document to the Congress. Over 80 changes were made to the document from the original draft of Thomas Jefferson, but they left these two phrases that shaped the way Americans think about their liberty. Thomas Jefferson said in the document that we know that all men are created equal, and they are endowed with inalienable rights from their Creator. Those two phrases shape the way all Americans think about their own liberty forevermore. So, all is well and good, right? Americans are enjoying their quest for liberty and pursuing happiness, and we all just get along. Isn't that correct? Well, not quite. In June of this year, 2019, Oregon became the 15th state, which also includes the District of Columbia, that approved legislation which would pool their electoral votes with the other 14 states in the District of Columbia and give them to the candidate, the executive candidate, who gains the most popular votes in the presidential election. This National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is odd because it runs parallel to our Constitution, which determines how we elect the executive. More importantly, though, this shows a real frustration with Americans about how we pursue our own liberty. And it may actually show a frustration with how we perceive where we get our liberty. What is it that Jefferson meant when he said that people have inalienable rights that are endowed by their Creator? Jefferson just didn't pluck these out of midair. He didn't invent them on their own. Jefferson was a Lockean. John Locke said this about people's rights. To understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature, asking without leave or depending upon the will of any other man. In Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence, he had included a paragraph near the end of the list of grievances. That paragraph accused King George III of proliferating slavery in the colonies. In fact, Jefferson said that King George III was violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty by captivating and carrying Africans into slavery, while he had been determined to keep open the slave market in America and suppressing every legislative attempt to end the institution. That paragraph was removed by the committee. That removal incensed Jefferson, and it was a sign of trouble yet to come for the young country. Thomas Jefferson was an agrarian. He believed that the economy was basically and essentially local, that things should be kept small, that people should focus on their community, and that community and culture was grounded in agriculture. Hamilton, though, believed in what he called debt, finance, and commerce. He believed in ideas such as creating an antithesis of the masses. It was a creation of classes that would, in fact, be opposed to each other in such a way that they would be distracted, and that, in the end, they would look to the leadership of the country for economic leadership. There's another problem, though. In the problem of slavery that we mentioned earlier, there were debates going on in the state of Virginia. A man named Robert Dew, who was a history professor at William and Mary, opposed Thomas Jefferson in his political economy. Dew said that Jefferson was wrong, that all men are not created equal. Jefferson was wrong that slavery is an evil, that the slave has a natural right to regain his liberty. All and most pompously put forth was wrong. He did what most Virginians would not do. He disagreed with the Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. But it's interesting to see what else Mr. Dew said. He said, "I may boldly assert that the framework of our Southern society is better calculated to ward off the evils of this agrarian spirit, demand of the majority to rule the nation, which is more destructive to morals, mind, and liberty than any other mention in the annals of history." From the founding, there was disagreement on how and who should obtain liberty in the nation. Slavery had finally come to an end. But that doesn't necessarily mean that African Americans were enjoying liberty to its fullest. Booker T. Washington was a former slave from Virginia. But according to Booker T. Washington, even after slavery, for some of the new freedmen, finance was a nightmare that led to poverty and dependence. The economy had become a ghost of Jefferson's liberty, and the substitution of Hamilton's national class economy that hovered as a contradiction above an otherwise productive system kept African Americans in economic chains. However, Washington wasn't focused on equity. Equity is the idea that there ought to be equal outcomes, not necessarily equal opportunity. Washington was a practical man, and he worked to help his people overcome the limitations that slavery and the institution had imposed upon them. He did this by promoting a chaste Jeffersonianism. Now, when I say that Washington was a Jeffersonian, I don't mean to say that Washington adopted all the political ideas and strategies of Jefferson. I don't even mean to say that he believed in Jefferson's republicanism. What I do mean to say was that Booker T. Washington was an agrarian. The proof is at least substantiated by one long quote from Booker T. Washington, which I do believe is a slam dunk. Washington said, after visiting Washington, D.C. and seeing many of his people who were in fact pretending to be like white people who had wealth, he said, "How many times I wished then, and have often wished since, that by some power of magic I might remove the great bulk of these people into the county districts and plant them upon the soil, upon the solid and never deceptive foundation of Mother Nature, where all nations and races that have ever succeeded have gotten their start, a start that at first may be slow and toilsome, but one that is nevertheless real." Jefferson himself never stated a more clear Jeffersonianism than Booker T. Washington did with that agrarian statement. So what is agrarianism? Agrarianism is a belief in not just an economic system, but a system of culture. It bases its belief on two Latin terms. One term is agricola. Agricola is the Latin term that means farmer or field. The other term is collunt. Collunt is a verb that has the meanings of cultivate and even has sacramental meanings such as faith or belief. These terms agrarians believe are what form a culture. the relationship between the people and the land that is focused and centered on the agriculture. If you'll notice, the term culture is derived from the word agriculture. That's an important thing to remember when you're reading Booker T. Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Du Bois' criticism didn't necessarily oppose the agrarianism of Washington, though, or of Jefferson. What it did oppose was traditionalism. Du Bois' ancestors, or his literary ancestors, were Emerson and Thoreau, transcendentalists who opposed tradition wherever it was. Du Bois followed well in their footsteps because he became a true progressive, one who opposed tradition, whatever it was, wherever it came from. To Du Bois, traditionalism in America represented slavery and the bonds that had been placed upon the African Americans who had been shipped against their will to the States. It's important to remember, though, Washington and Du Bois were not each other's antithesis, much as American progressives and conservatives are not today. Nor were they completely alike. Between them both, there were disunified views in regards of how best to achieve liberty. Both found that liberty in the words of Jefferson, but both were living in a Hamiltonian America. It's been over 150 years, yet economic equality has not come to the African American community. Yet the same conditions exist in Appalachia. John Hisnanic of the U.S. Census Bureau wrote in an essay about income inequality in Appalachia. In the Appalachian region, historically, average and median household incomes are below the United States average and median. Poverty rates are higher, labor force participation rates are lower, and there are even greater disparities when one considers the region's more distressed counties. If that's true, though, why is it that Appalachians see their way to liberty so much differently than African Americans? Both African Americans and Appalachians agree on Jefferson's definition, and they assume it as their own. But just as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois agreed about African American liberty, they also disagreed on how best to achieve it. There's been little room lately for that kind of disagreement in American culture, though. For all of these ideological descendants of Thomas Jefferson, liberty has become their American dream. It's entertaining to wonder what Jefferson would have thought if he could have been with us today. What would he say? I believe that Andrew Nelson Lytle, a Jeffersonian and a mentor of Wendell Berry, summed it up pretty nicely in his essay, The Hind Tit. He said, "Since 1865, an agrarian union has been changed into an industrial empire bent on conquest of the earth's goods and ports to sell them in. Wealth, so that imperialism may prevail, has brought upon the social body a more deadly conflict, one which promises to deprive it not of life, but of living. Take the concept of liberty from the political consciousness and turn the pursuit of happiness into a nervous running around, which is without the logic even of a dog chasing his tail." The frustration, I'm afraid, that Americans have comes from the idea that they believe they're Jeffersonians living in a Jeffersonian America, where rights are things that are enjoyed by all people and that they're endowed to all people. Unfortunately, that's probably not the case. In 1992, in a celebratory comment, columnist George Will, a Republican and neoconservative, wrote that there is an elegant memorial in Washington to Jefferson, but none to Hamilton. However, if you seek Hamilton's monument, look around. You're living in it. We honor Jefferson, but we live in Hamilton's country, a mighty industrial nation with a strong central government. We've been duped with a bait and switch, and that, my friends, is why Americans are frustrated with liberty, the American dream.